guys, so I'm here to talk to you guys about a very common question. I had this question for the longest time, and it's something I'm still learning about. As some of you guys may or may not know, I've been involved in documentary production about the history of Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil. And with that idea came a lot of questions, some of them that I had asked myself already, some of them are very common questions like this one, and some questions that were kind of new to me. So one of the most common questions is which one came first, Judo or Jiu-Jitsu? And it's a little more complex than that because our definition of Jiu-Jitsu today is drastically different from a definition of a pre-Meiji era. Meiji is like the period where Japan goes through all this, this modernization, right, so to speak. So in Jiu-Jitsu prior to this modernization meant something very different. You think of the term Jiu-Jitsu as a vague term, like something like akin to martial art today. So you say martial arts, you have an idea of what we're talking about, but it could be taekwondo, it could be karate, it could be judo, and so on, right? So, this vague word, the term jiu-jitsu, basically encompassed a variety of schools, and some of these schools are very different from one another. There was not a universal rule set where people agreed on, right? So you had some schools that were specializing in throws, some specializing in strikes. I've even seen traditional jiu-jitsu schools today, that still exist that specialize with weapons. Right, so that gives an idea of what Jiu-Jitsu meant prior to Judo, prior to the Meiji modernization. So it's a very broad term, very vague term. At some point, a man called Jigoro Kano, who I'm sure you've heard of, he's the father of not only Judo and of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, he's the father of all martial arts. Like the concept of martial arts that we have today was founded by Jigoro Kano. Prior to him, there were techniques that were practiced, but it was not martial art as we understand it today, right? Jigoro Kano had a vision for an educational system that went well beyond just learning how to fight and defend yourself, right? So you got to understand the context of what's going on in Japan during that period. I'm no specialist in the period, but from my understanding, what is happening is Japan is going through this forced modernization, right? The shogun was very resistant to open up to commerce, to open up to the world, right? At some point, Commodore Perry holds him at gunpoint and goes, "You're going to open up to commerce, or we're going to bomb the city of Edo," like Edo in modern Tokyo. And the shogun, of course, has to open. He's forced to it, and that begins the story of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Really, if you want to take it that far back, that's where it would really begin because Japan had to change, right? It had to open up. It's interesting. Like the first contact, the first challenge is a challenge between sumo wrestlers and American sailors, right? This is a good read on this is Craze by Roberto Pedreira. It's available on Amazon and talks a lot about this period. It's very interesting. And the Jigoro Kano is heavily influenced by these new ideas, right? So I didn't know this, but this is something we learned too. But Jigoro Kano was also influenced by Western wrestling, right, and Western philosophy. The ideas of education that were commonplace in the West, but were very different in Japan at the time. So he takes this. He is also influenced by sumo wrestling and two other jiu-jitsu schools, or Rus, as they were called at the time. And he basically built a curriculum. So he creates a curriculum. And originally this curriculum was called, not by himself, but by other people, Kano Jiu-Jitsu, because people just saw it as a curriculum that Kano had created, but it was still a jiu-jitsu school like any other. Kano is a very influential individual. He's very savvy. He's very ambitious. He has a vision for the future. He begins to lobby heavily within not just the Japanese government, but also worldwide to make his school something bigger than that, right? Not just a school, targeting students in his area, but it's like a broader vision, right? Like that vision would later manifest itself through, becoming judo as we know it, as a worldwide sport. He creates his curriculum, and amongst his students, many of his students would travel and leave Japan, early in the 20th century for economic reasons, right? These immigrants, they were very poor. Japan was not as developed then as it is now, and they're just leaving the country because they're looking for a better opportunity. So there's this myth about like, oh, they're just leaving because they want to spread the gospel of judo. Not true. Now, a lot of the confusion comes from the fact that during this period, why these Japanese are leaving, the terms jiu-jitsu and judo were still used interchangeably, with the term jiu-jitsu still being popular. Later that's going to change. But a lot of the students from Kodokan, a lot of the Japanese that were not necessarily Jigoro Kano students from Kodokan, they're still using the term Jujitsu as this Jiu-Jitsu boom, you know, like it occurs and it takes place all over the world, and everyone's very curious about Japan at the East because, you know, Japan went on to defeat the Russians in war. And that, like, that whole story started where the small is going to defeat the large, right? Like the little can defeat the big one if he has technique. So there's, you know, the Japanese use this as a marketing scheme to be able to, you know, to sell their techniques around the world as a means of surviving, as a means of making a living through something they knew, and the West and the rest of the world was very curious about. So these Japanese are teaching all over the world, and they're fighting a lot of spectacles, especially in circuses. You know, a lot of fake matches go on as well, but the term Jiu-Jitsu was very popular at the time. Now, Jigoro Kano, with his vision for martial arts being not only a means to learn how to fight, but also for education, he actually dislikes the term Jiu-Jitsu for this reason, so he attempts to dissociate himself from the term Jiu-Jitsu. He begins to use the term Judo, right? Jiu-Jitsu means gentle art, right? Judo means the gentle way. So it was more than just an art, it was a way of life. So it's a little broader you know, definition of what should be taught in a school. So he begins to distance himself from the term Jiu-Jitsu. Many of his students, Maeda being, Maeda wasn't directly a student of Jigoro Kano, but under the same school, you know, Jigoro Kano had founded. He's probably the most famous of these Japanese because of, you know, the Gracie family would later make Maeda very famous, but that's a whole different story. But Maeda's by no means the only one who was teaching Jiu-Jitsu around the world. And because he had left at a time where the term Jiu-Jitsu was more popular, he was still using the term Jiu-Jitsu even though he was really teaching Judo, right? He was teaching what he had learned from at Kodokan. Even though, like, Maeda was also influenced by catch wrestling. He traveled around the world competing and fighting many cross matches with catch wrestlers, and, you know, no doubt he was influenced by catch wrestling as well. Remember, Judo was influenced by Western wrestling. So, you know, he comes with this experience to Brazil when he moves and decides to settle down in Brazil once and for all. Well, so once the term Judo and Jiu-Jitsu begin to, like, you know, Judo becomes more popular, they become to distance themselves a little bit more. Jigoro Kano had a preference for stand-up. He thought that being on the ground was, you know, like, the ground is meant for animals. Humans are supposed to walk upright, you know, like, not verbatim his words, but pretty much the idea was he compares fighting on the ground to being an animal. His idea was one of, you know, self-defense. He believed against multiple attackers, you'd be better off fighting on your feet than on the ground, which makes perfect sense if you're fighting multiple people. If you have only one opponent, it makes more sense to take the fight to the ground. But in a situation where many people are attacking you, Jigoro Kano was not incorrect. It might have been influenced too by the ideas of what a gentleman was supposed to look like and how a gentleman should behave at the time. The concept of being a gentleman, you know, someone who's well dressed and behaves as a gentleman, was very alive at the time. These days that concept doesn't really, people don't talk about it anymore, it's not a thing, but at the time that was important. So it might have been something like that. A gentleman is not meant to be on the ground, he's supposed to be standing the whole time. Be that as it may, whatever the case, Jigoro Kano, he begins to, the Kodokan curriculum begins to eliminate a lot of techniques. So they eliminate shoulder locks, they eliminate wrist locks, foot locks, and it becomes very stand-up oriented. Now, the Japanese that were teaching in Brazil, many of them were more or less familiar with these rules, with these changes, and they're teaching on many Brazilians. So the Gracie family is, you know, allegedly taught Carlos, and Carlos taught, you know, number of his brothers and so on. But they, for strategical purposes, these Brazilians, right, largely represented by the Gracie family, but not only them, they're going to focus on the ground. They're still teaching, they're teaching Judo, there's no way out. They're teaching what Maeda taught them. But they're using the term Jiu-Jitsu because that's what Maeda used. Remember, like this, the terms are going through changes during this time. So you should think of these two terms, Judo and Jiu-Jitsu, as they are used interchangeably, the same way we use grappling and no-gi, or grappling and submission wrestling, right? They mean the same thing, right? But slowly you can see them distancing themselves as Brazilians more and more opt to use the term Jiu-Jitsu, and the Japanese, influenced by the growth of Kodokan around the world, right, Jigoro Kano school, begin more and more to side with the term Judo. I believe that Brazilians had a preference for the ground for basically two reasons. One, they couldn't hang with the Japanese on their feet. So the classic example is a match between Helio Gracie and one of the Ono brothers, where Ono takes him down 32 times, right? But the match is officially a draw because there are no points in place. Like Helio would insist on not being any points in place because he had a chance of surviving that way, because there's no way out of it. The Japanese were more skilled at that time. The second time they fought, it was, I believe, 26 or 27, I can't recall now, takedowns to nothing, same thing. I think Helio might have taken him down once, don't trust my memory now. But same result, it's officially a draw, right? Because the Brazilians just didn't like to fight the Japanese with a universal rule set. Because in a universal rule set, or the ones that were coming from Japan with the point system in place, they just couldn't hang with the Japanese. So they have to create a rule set where they did better. What's super interesting about this is that a very similar movement is happening today in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, where the submission-only movement, they opt to change the rule set and specialize in it because they have a better shot at beating people who are used to a point system, right? So by changing the rule set, you can actually carve a niche and say, like, you know what, I'm going to specialize in this, and you guys can do that over there, and you guys can be the king of your world, and I'll be the king of my world. And I think that there's there was a lot of resentment over the fact that they couldn't outdo the Japanese. The Japanese were just more technical. There's no way out of it. A second reason has to do with what I believe is infrastructure in Brazil. Now, infrastructure in Brazil, anyone who's ever been there knows this. The gyms are very small. They don't have big warehouses with big mats, which is commonplace in the U.S. It's also commonplace if you're practicing judo or wrestling because you have government funding. Remember, judo and wrestling are Olympic sports, so they're very prestigious, and they normally carry some sort of funding. You don't have to, it's not like a private owner like myself that I have to pay rent by myself in order to run a jiu-jitsu gym. You probably have some funding behind you, which allows for more space, bigger mats. In Brazil, you don't have this, right? So jiu-jitsu develops very organically and independent from any government assistance. So as a result, you end up with like very small spaces to train in. Now, anyone who's ever trained jiu-jitsu before knows that if you're going to start standing, you need more room to be able to apply and execute throws. If you're going to be starting on your knees, you can actually have more people go in a small space. Now, during the filming of the documentary, we had the opportunity to visit the original Jiu-Jitsu Academy on the Rua Marquês de Abrantes, número 106. Marquês de Abrantes is the name of the street, number 106. That's where the original Jiu-Jitsu Academy was founded. It is not founded by the Gracie family. It is founded by Donato Pires dos Reis in 1930, not 1925. There's no such thing as a Gracie Academy in 1925. And interesting, this original Jiu-Jitsu Academy in Rio de Janeiro is next door to Andre Pederneiras' gym in Rio. It's called Upper, just a coincidence, right? That's where Jose Aldo used to train, and many people from the Novo União camp that came up through that gym. But what's so interesting about this original Jiu-Jitsu Academy is that it's very small. It's like we're talking a little bit bigger than a bathroom here. Like it's probably the size of this room right here. And I can't see you having more than 4 people training at a time. Like if you had them stand up, it just wouldn't fit. Very small space. So you can understand why Brazilians would specialize on the ground if they're all trained under very, very tight, space. There's no room to stand up. So I think that right there already exacerbates something that was already in place in terms of Brazilians trying to carve out a niche within, official judo rules where they could actually win, right? Because they couldn't hang with the Japanese standing. And even on the ground, if you applied a rule set with points, the Japanese probably had an edge. So it is a myth, in my opinion, that, Brazilians revolutionized the ground game. If you watch what the Japanese were doing in 1940s, 50s, 60s, like through Kosen Judo, you can see the Japanese are far more sophisticated in terms of groundwork. The triangle is a prime example. You have pictures of the Ono brothers doing executing the triangle in the 1930s. We spoke to Hobson Gracie, Carlos Gracie Jr., Flavio Bering. These guys didn't even know what a triangle was until like the late 70s. They hadn't even seen a triangle. They learned it from judokas. Same thing with the Ezekiel choke. As the cross-training between Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Judo went on, because there was still some cross-training, the Brazilians in reality were learning from the judokas. They were either bringing techniques from Japan, or they had Japanese instructors who knew a lot of these techniques. The Ono brothers were known for being specialists on the ground. Even though they were officially judokas, they actually, they were a little bit at odds with the official judo rule set in that they would spend a lot of time on the ground grappling, right? So I think that for these reasons, it's, once again, it's a myth that, Brazilians revolutionized the ground. My opinion is the Japanese were ahead of Brazilians in terms of technique up to like the early 90s, like right around the time IBJJF came into existence, in 1994 to be precise. Because if you watch what was going on, like if you watch the techniques of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there's footage of them grappling, right? And then you contrast it with what many of the Japanese were doing. This is a judgment not as a practitioner, as a coach, as someone who has dedicated his life to Jiu-Jitsu. You can't compare the two technically. The Japanese are far ahead. It is the inception of IBJJF that raises the bar in Brazil, right? The number of competitions, and from then onwards, you can really see Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, right, take off. And then from that point onwards, like things really change. What's really interesting is we had the opportunity to visit a couple Kosen Kosen schools inside universities in Japan, Tokyo and Kyoto. And I spoke to some of the practitioners. They're all very young, just college students. And what was super interesting to me is that their references weren't judokas. Their references, they practiced Kosen Judo, right? But their references were Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners. So they knew all the world champions in the IBJJF league, and they were very familiar with everyone, and they're asking questions about them, and like some of them knew who I was and so on. I thought it was interesting because the tables had turned. It wasn't, Japan was no longer teaching Brazil. Now Brazil was teaching Japan. But just going back to the original question, the term Jiu-Jitsu, once again, is a traditional term. It's more archaic. Judo was a more modern term for a long time. Brazilians held on to the term Jiu-Jitsu because that's what the first wave of Japanese that came over from Japan were using. And it was almost like a silent agreement amongst Brazilians and judokas. They go, you know what, you're going to use this term, and you can do things differently, and we're going to stick to this more popular rule set in this sport called judo that's blowing up around the world. It has government support, later will be Olympic sport, and it was very prestigious. So it was like a silent agreement, the way I see it, the way I understand it, between both sides, where one side was going to refer to it as judo, and the other one was going to refer to it as jiu-jitsu. In my view, the correct term would be Brazilian Judo, not Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because they were not practicing any of the Jiu-Jitsu styles that predate the Meiji era. Brazilians were practicing what the Japanese taught. Most of these Japanese, almost all of them, to my knowledge, came from Kodokan. So they were teaching Judo, even though Judo rules during that time were going through changes, which explains some of the differences between, the sport of Jiu-Jitsu and Judo going in different directions. But really, there's no way out of it. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu came from Judo, it came from Kodokan, but the term Jiu-Jitsu is much older. I hope that makes sense. I hope that doesn't sound too complicated.